Sí.
Oh, right. That's the name.
Perhaps we can just get started.
That's good.
All right. Welcome to our virtual seminar series. Today we have a very interesting paper that ties politics with real estate, with economy. The paper is All Economic Politics is Local Voting Responses to Localize the Price Shocks During the Great Recession by Ron Chang from Oberlin College and Rachel Melzer from Harvard. The floor is yours, Ron and Rachel.
Thank you very much, Liang. So I will be doing the presentation as Rachel will have to duck out to teach a class, but we really welcome the opportunity to answer questions and to take comments about this paper, which we've been working on for a little while now. So this paper is about the intersection, as Liang says, between economics, politics, and real estate and housing. And we're not just a caveat, of course, is that neither Rachel or I are political scientists, so we're taking a sort of an economic view of voting. And so what we try to do in this paper is we are trying to look to see how a particular economic shock, a negative economic shock, what its role is on political participation. But what we add to it is the idea of spatialness, which is like, how does a neighborhood level shock affect political participation? So where we're coming from is this recognition, that a longstanding recognition that that economics informs how people vote and when people vote. I mean, in this paper, we're not obviously going to be able to look and see how people vote, because that's private information. But the question of why people vote has been well studied. There's been a lot of papers that have looked into how voters base their decisions on whether to vote or to participate in the political process on economics. So they use both proximate information, like really close information to them, and also information about the local economic conditions, the broader economic conditions, to inform whether or not they are going to participate in the political process. So when a negative economic shock occurs, so we can imagine that its effect on voting could be made up of two countervailing forces. One is this kind of mobilization effect, which is that when you're not doing well economically, you want to punish your elected officials, or you want to seek relief or remedy from the political from the powers that be. And so you might imagine that this may cause an increased mobilization and higher political participation. On the other hand, there's this idea of a withdrawal effect, which is that if your economic conditions are not good, you're more focused about something like paying your mortgage, paying your rent, as opposed to doing something like casting a vote in an election. So you're focusing on your personal economic pressures. It's going to lead to lower voter participation. So putting these together, we don't really know if there is one consistent story that we can tell on how a shock affects voting, but we can kind of think of we can think a little bit about how the information that is being used by a voter might come from different places. So what we did in this paper was we looked at different ways in which voters use economic information in what context to decide whether or not to participate in local politics. So there is a classic story of economic responses to macroeconomic conditions. So whether or not there's a recession or an economic boom, these are things that have been shown to affect how and why people vote. So we call this sociotropic behavior. So there's been papers looking at whether or not there's an incumbent politician on the ballot, looking at whether voters party affiliation is a factor, and also demographic conditions of the voters, of the race of a voter, the income of a voter, and so on. So we call these things sociotropic factors in deciding whether or not to vote. On the other hand, we also know that local economic conditions can only go so far. There are also personal reasons for deciding whether or not to vote. So the proximity of individual circumstances. In the political science literature, we saw that was called egotropic voting. And this egotropic voting is basically, individual characteristics and the decision on whether or not to vote. One of the most classic stories in our urban literature, of course, is the idea of home ownership and the home voter hypothesis. So if you're a homeowner, right, you're going to vote in order to maintain and to keep the interests in your interests in things that maintain an interest in keeping those property values high, right? So egotropic voting would explain observations such as why homeowners may be more likely to vote in elections that have more to do with local issues such as things like zoning or have direct impacts like property tax, for example, property tax limitations. We also, in this literature, also have evidence to suggest that demographic and personal characteristics also affect, how likely you are to vote. So this is these types of studies look at characteristics such as whiteness, advanced age, homeownership, all of these factors being ones that make it more likely for individuals to participate in the political process. In these types of studies, couple of kind of broad trends in literature have been kind of observed. One is that national economic conditions seem to matter as much or even more than individual economic circumstances. But at the end of the day, because of the presence of both of these, it does seem to say that salience and proximity of information do matter. And that's the reason why we look at the geographic gap that exists in this literature. The geographic gap is that in between sort of big national shocks and individual level shocks based on things like losing a job or healthcare challenges, there's a neighborhood level challenges. And so we're talking about the idea of localized economic conditions. So localized economic conditions can in fact mediate the broad macroeconomic information. So for example, the study that we're looking at is on the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. Well, we know broadly that was a broad national drop in house prices. But if we are able to look more closely at local areas, we actually find that that broad national narrative is mediated by the fact that some neighborhoods did not really suffer from the Great Recession. Indeed, we actually found in our data that some neighborhoods in the Tampa area actually had increases in property value during this time period. So if we had, if we were able to be able to see these localized economic shocks, it would give better context to these individual circumstances on deciding whether or not to participate in the political process. We can also see, on the other hand, instead of mediation, it could be exacerbation. So in other words, what you could see is that localized shocks or crises could actually be even more pronounced in areas and lead to a greater response in political participation if those shocks are big enough. So what we aim to show in this paper is that neighborhood effects really do matter. And these neighborhood effects need to be considered if we're talking about trying to understand such a broad and large shock as the Great Recession.
And Ron,
Yes,
if
Luis.
just one clarifying question. So you present these two theories as competing, right? But in a way, this is a macroeconomic condition,
Mhm.
but it affects different locations differently, right? So
Right.
this kind of division and approach could probably also apply to any macroeconomic condition, and it's just so that researchers had been looking at it, hadn't been looking at it from a localized perspective, right? So
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Our intent was not to try to pick one theory versus another, but to illustrate the importance of thinking about a broad shock as a combination of a broad economic shock and also localized economic shocks.
And I'll jump in, and Ron, I think maybe it's the next slide, or the slide after is also going to get into that. There is something helpful though, looking at the Great Recession and the channels through housing in particular, because housing markets have this, right, kind of localized feature, and the Great Recession, right, was kind of a global event that, you know, fed through housing markets at that scale too. So you're right, like hopefully this can extend to other global shocks, local impacts, but the Great Recession is a really useful, I think, case to try to understand this. And I think Ron will talk about that more.
Great. I'm sorry, I'm not I see something popped up in the chat and I'm not so good with with this.
I'll get it, Ron, before I hop off.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So Rachel was absolutely correct in that I'm going to spend just one slide talking a little bit about why we're talking about this one particular recession and one particular shock. We choose to use we try to look at the Great Recession because of the fact that, you know, the alternative to it is to look at, you know, things like employment shocks to try to explain why some people vote. But we argue that housing shocks might be a little bit more telling than employment shocks for a couple of reasons. Number one is that we do think that housing is it's more easy for us to locally identify the impacts of that type of shock. So employment rates obviously capture more broader economic conditions, and these geographies that employment shocks cover over are usually bigger and more heterogeneous than the neighborhoods that we are going to be looking at. So the neighborhood, our definition is going to be the census tract, and these shocks or the zip code, I'm sorry, and these zip codes, these shocks at the zip code level are going to be a little bit more direct and a little bit more precise than shocks to employment, which tends to affect a whole metropolitan area. And we also think that housing has a really nice through line to voter participation through a couple of things. One is that there's this classic home voter effect, which is that for the vast majority of U.S. households that have some assets, right, the biggest asset is their home. And the Great Recession represented an enormous threat to the value of these homes. And you could imagine then that would lead to individuals wanting to protect or to protect that biggest asset through political participation or political mobilization. On the other hand, you might expect that, you know, when your biggest asset is under threat, the resource effect could take over, which means basically that your attention is not on sort of political participation. Talking about that withdrawal effect, that reduction in home value really constrains your ability, your time to participate, or your desire to participate in the political process. There's also a local public finance effect, which is that there's this threat of the loss of public services through reductions in prices. So if the house values go down, tax collections go down, public services may suffer. That itself could be a nice through line to why individuals would think that the the shocks to their housing price would have an impact on their well-being. All right. And finally, we may think that housing could have a differential impact, and this is something where employment shocks may not be able to capture as well, but we are going to be able to look at how housing price shocks can actually affect your participation in different types of elections, whether that be federal elections, state elections, or most saliently local elections. So we believe that looking at the Great Recession and looking at housing price shocks is a way for us to get at the question of how localized shocks affect your desire to participate in the political process. So for our paper now, let me just talk a little bit about the context. Our paper is going to focus on the Great Recession, which we define as the period, the fourth quarter of 2007 to the second quarter of 2009. I would note that we did try different windows different windows for the Great Recession, and depending on slightly different definitions of the recession, and it really didn't change many of the results. So we're just going to focus on these particular this particular window for this presentation. I mean, certainly, I don't think anybody disputes the fact that the macroeconomic effects of the Great Recession were really broad, but also extremely salient. So given that this was something that was macroeconomically universal in the country, right, where there was this sudden and large drops in average housing prices, it is one of these things where we could imagine there could be an immediate sociotropic kind of response, where basically people will respond to sort of this great economic conditions with changes in their political behavior. But what was really interesting about, as we were looking into this, is we saw that there's been a lot of work done on looking at how the effects of the Great Recession were really unevenly distributed. And let me just give you a little bit of just context here. Most papers have really looked at how the effects of the Great Recession vary greatly across metros, right? I mean, I think nobody would dispute the statistics and the observations that, places like Miami and Tampa suffered a lot more in the Great Recession than in places like Cleveland or St. Louis, right? Less is known, however, about variation within a metropolitan area. There's been a couple of papers looking at how within a metropolitan area, whether or not the effects of the Great Recession were localized. One paper, for instance, by Williams et al. In 2013, found that within the Chicago area, the Great Recession actually created slightly different trajectories across different neighborhoods within the same city. So this is where we would like to focus our attention, because we think that within the large, broader metropolitan area of Tampa, there is a significant degree of heterogeneity, both in incomes, in property values, in race, in local industry, that we might expect the impacts of that Great Recession to be very, very different. As I have mentioned, our study area is the 4 counties of the Tampa metropolitan area. So in order of population, they are Hillsborough County, which contains the city of Tampa, then Pinellas, which contains St. Petersburg, and then 2 more suburban counties, Pasco and then Hernando, so which contains the suburbs and the exurbs of the Tampa area. We chose to focus on Tampa because among the metropolitan areas of Florida, it actually has a good degree of heterogeneity, both in rural and urbanicity, both in terms of race and also in terms of income. We also recognize that with our analysis, which links voter registration files to to parcels of residential property, that if we tried to do this for the entire state, it would just be a computational and sort of data nightmare. This our data set itself has over 1.2 million unique voter registrants over 10 years. So extending that to the rest of the state is something that we have not tried to do just for computational simplicity. So I cannot say very much about the extendability of the results from this paper to other counties in Florida, unfortunately. But let me tell you a little bit about what we did for the data. We chose to focus on a 10-year period between 2006 to 2016. What we did was we collected from the Department of Revenue the full tax assessment rolls for the 4 counties in the Tampa metropolitan area. So those rolls have the parcel coordinates, information about the type of the dwelling, date and price of the last 2 sales, as well as detailed information that assessors generally use to assess properties, things like square footage, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, garages, pools, and so on. We took that data set and we also obtained from the 4 boards of election the list of registered voters in that county as of 2016. It should be noted that the way that voter registration rolls work is that, if you register, you're added to the roll, and if you're unregistered or you move away or you pass away, you get removed from the rolls. So it's a dynamic roll. So it's not possible for us to get the registrant rolls at a certain date and time, at a certain point in time in the past. So we could not get the voter rolls as of 2007, for instance. So what we do have to do is we have a process which I will describe to ensure that our data is reflective of and consistent with a set of voters who have been who are homeowners within the entire time period between 2006 and 2016. Of course, with the voter registration rolls, you do get some information about the voter's history. And the voter's history, of course, is whether or not they voted in any particular election. And you also know whether they voted in person or absentee, although we don't use that information. And lastly, we do know the registrant's home address, their age, their gender. There is a marker for race and ethnicity, and there is a marker for the party affiliation at the time of registration. The last data set that we have is a set of election a set of information regarding the elections that were held between 2006 and 2016. There are, of course, many different types of elections that could be possible. There are the general elections that have federal offices, state offices, county offices, and even local offices all at the same time. There are some elections that just have one or a combination of different types of races. Right? So the simplest type of election would be like a municipal election, which only has local races. We hand collected the elections, all the elections between 2006 and 2016 in this time period, and we categorized the type of election according to what kind of races were on the ballot. So we had RAs actually look at the ballots of each of those elections and check off how many and count how many federal offices were being voted for, how many state offices, how many local offices were being elected on that one on each ballot that a voter would face. So with that, we actually get a lot of really detailed sort of fine-grained information on what kind of election this voter is deciding whether or not to vote in. So just to give you a little bit of context here, we chose to, again, let the recession be the period between 2007 and 2009. So just to avoid having the confounding effects of the of being right in the middle of the recession, we discard the elections that were held between 2007 and 2009. And we classified the pre-recession period as the period before the fourth quarter of 2007 and the after recession period after the second quarter of 2009. So that's what I'm going to call the before recession and the after recession period. So there were 5 elections held in our data set before the recession, and in those and there were 36 of them, 36 elections held afterward. I just realized that in my table, the second and third columns shouldn't be elections, should be races. But in those elections, you saw 5 different municipal races. So 5 different races for mayor, councilor, and so on. 2 different races for county, so like county commissioner and so on. And the state and the federal would be would have been a senator and state representative, a federal congressional representative. And similarly, with the recession, after recession, we had a good variety of municipal races, county races, and state and federal races. So what another thing that we did with the data was we had to be very careful about how we treated the data in that registration role. So what we need to do is we actually need to try to maintain a consistent database of the voters who stayed within the same house and therefore faced the same kind of local economic shock throughout the entire study period. So what we also do is we try to identify the people who moved and try to take them out of the sample. So what we do see, of course, is that we see the address of the registrant at the time of the data poll, which was 2016, right? And we are, of course, concerned about the movement to a different, like the voter came from a different zip code and moved to this zip code. So what we try to do is we have in the paper try to restrict the data only to owner-occupied homes and only registrants who are in properties that had no sales prior to the election. So in other words, we would be looking at only those houses that really was lived in by the same, we can be pretty sure was lived in by the same voter between 2006 and 2016. Right. Just some quick data and some quick graphs on sort of a dependent variable. So our dependent variable is going to be whether or not a voter votes in a particular election. So that will be a yes or a no. It's a binary variable. You can see here that you know, there's a good mix of voter turnout. Voter turnout, you know, is of course not very high for many elections, particularly ones with sort of not marquee races. So, for example, elections held in 2007, which is not a year that which is a year that would only have municipal elections, have exceedingly low turnout. But we do see that there is a variation in turnout across the years. So with just municipal turnouts, the turnout is exceedingly low. If you add in county election, if you look at those elections that have both municipal and county races, the turnout's a little bit higher. And of course, where you would see the most extensive turnout, it would be in those types of elections that combine both a municipal, a county, and general races. So for example, in fall of 2006, right, it was a presidential election. Sorry, not presidential. It was a general election where there was, you know, both where there were all a combination of local state and federal races all being contested in that year. And you can see that for any of the even number years that turn out significantly higher than new municipal and county elections. So the reason why I'm showing you this is actually to show you that there is some variability, significant variability in political participation, and there might be a difference between the types of voters who might turn out for a municipal election versus the type of voter who turns out for an election that has a bit of everything, has federal, state, and municipal races on the ballot. Let me tell you a little bit about how we go about estimating our model. We're going to do this in 2 stages. The first stage is we need to identify the local economic shock. The second is taking that local economic shock and then putting it into a model, a linear model of voter turnout. To look at local economic shocks, it's useful just to start looking at sort of like the broader trends first before we look very locally. This is the FHFA house price index for the 4 counties in the Tampa metropolitan area. I apologize that the axis is a little bit hard to read, but I think we can all kind of guess at to where the Great Recession is, right? So the Great Recession is this part here where it falls, and we see that, you know, generic universal trend down in house prices after a healthy climb up as a result of the recession. So again, we see this universal trend, but does it mean that within a county that this trend is observed in every neighborhood? So what we do is in the first stage, we for our sample of sales we take a window before and after the recession. So we take between 2006 and 2012. We estimate for each zip code a hedonic model where we regress the price of the sales on a set of property characteristics as well as a recession indicator. So this set of property characteristics is the one available in the assessor's file. So it includes things like lot size, property age, square footage, and so on. And the predicted price from this regression is what we take to the next stage to instrument for that localized price shock.
Ron, maybe you're going to explain this, but your recession indicator here has both I and T variation, right? So it is not just before, it's not indicating only that the recession has begun, I don't know, after 2008. How do you build it individually for each neighborhood?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that would be a typo. It should just be a recession. It's just an indicator of the of post recession. We don't have that as differing across different zip codes. I apologize for that.
Okay, and so and the price that you predict from this is the price. It's not like you are turning off the recession for the years after the recession. You're not trying to predict the price that you would have obtained in the absence of a recession. You're just trying to get the average price for a unit with those characteristics.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Is there a reason you use a recession dummy and not time dummies?
That we did use. We had a specification where we ran it with bins basically for time dummies. The results really didn't change, so we thought the recession was just a little bit cleaner. Yeah.
And you can show the R squared from this regression. I don't have that on me. I will make a note to try to get, I will get that to you, David. Sure. I'm sorry about that. No, that's fine.
Yeah, R squared from first.
But this is at the zip code level?
It's at the zip code level. Yeah.
The X here would be like average characteristics? of the units in the.
Oh, sorry, we do this per zip code. Like, so for a zip code, we run this set of models, and then we get the predicted prices, and then we average these over the zip code.
All right. So you're allowing the coefficients to change.
Yes,
by
the
zip.
coefficients can change by zip code. All right. So for this predicted change in price, once we average, once we average over the zip code, this is a plot of that predicted change in price as a result of the Great Recession. Each symbol is different according to the county that it's in. So if we look at the squares, for instance, so that's the biggest county, Hillsborough. So if you look at the orange squares, we arrange the zip codes in population from the smallest to the largest. So over here would be our largest, most populated zip codes within Hillsborough County, and these would be the smallest. And if you look at the distribution of these orange squares, you see that there are squares both above and below the zero axis. In other words, while it is the case that the majority of zip codes lie underneath the horizontal axis, there are still zip codes whose property prices on average went up as after the Great Recession. So this tells us that there really is something to the idea that there are these local economic shocks, that local housing price shocks. This we observe for every county, but as I say, the effect is most pronounced for the largest county, Hillsborough.
So Ron, sorry, it seems like another way to do this is not to run these regressions, but just to take house price indices at different geographic levels, separate people. Like the FHFA produces house price indices by census tract.
Mm-hmm.
So you can compare the performance of house prices in different census tracts in the same zip code.
Right.
And I expect you'd get a fairly similar graph, but I don't know how that would affect results. I'm just wondering, it's nice to see things done different ways and get the same results. So I don't know if you've tried that. It might be something to try.
No, we've not tried. We've not tried that. We thought that we would just use we have the rich data set which has the property characteristics, and we have so we with that finer data, we thought we'd better get a more precise estimate of that predicted change in zip codes. But certainly what you suggest could work as well, and we could give that a try. We'd take a look at an alternative measure. Yeah.
The reason I asked about the R squared is that hedonic regressions are, everyone uses them. I get that, but they are pretty famously low R squareds. So and then the FHFA is very sophisticated with how they produce house price indices. They're as good as it's going to get. So I think that'd be a good robustness check.
Great, thank you. All right. All right. So we take the predicted price shock. So basically, what we do with the first stage model is we then use that to define variables for whether or not a particular house's zip code has experienced a negative economic shock from the Great Recession. So what we do is we use we create two different types of negative shock variables. One we'll call the binary shock variable, and the other we're going to call the continuous shock variable. The binary shock is very simple. It's 0 or 1, and basically it takes a value of 1 if the price the predicted price shock at the zip code level is negative. So those would be all of your zip codes underneath that horizontal axis from the last slide, right? The other one is interacting that negative shock binary with the absolute value of the price shock. So it allows the price shock to vary by magnitude. We did wrestle with the question of whether or not we should make this symmetric. So we should also look at positive shocks in the same way as negative shocks. So defining it either a positive shock, a dummy, separately, or just simply say, let the sign of the shock go from negative to positive. We decided at the end of the day to focus on the negative shocks because the hallmark of the Great Recession was these falling prices, and we wanted to see whether or not the local conditions exacerbated or mitigated or mediated that negative shock. But I'm happy to share those results with those other types of models with anybody who's interested. So with that in mind, our second stage model, the turnout model, is a linear regression which regresses turnout on the left-hand side on two recession-based indicators. Beta 1 is in front of just a recession index. So that's the idea of the overall impact of the Great Recession. So that's the general macroeconomic effect of the Great Recession that it had on political participation on a particular voter. Beta 2 is the coefficient of interest because it interacts the recession dummy with our definition of a negative shock. We also add in a vector of election features. So after a few different iterations, we settled on the vector being the number of general races on the ballot, the number of state races on a particular ballot, and the number of local races on a particular ballot. We also have zip year controls to account for local variations in the economy. And then sort of our crux of our analytical strategy is that we have individual voter fixed effects. So DIs are at the individual voter levels. So we're really identifying off these changes on how individuals change their voting behavior based on sort of the local economic shock that they face, the housing shock that they face.
And Ron, why? I mean, you have such rich data on unit level and voter, but I guess the problem for doing this and by capturing the actual individual economic shock is that you do not have the mapping between the unit price decline and the voter behavior of the owner, right? You do not observe. You observe individual voting behavior at the zip code level, but you don't know where they live. What happened with their home.
Could you repeat that last part? I may.
You do not observe people's homes and their voting behavior, right? You have this micro data on voting behavior. You have this micro data on housing prices, but you have to move up to the zip code level in your analysis because you don't know exactly what happened to the price of each individual voter.
Right. No, I'm sorry if I was unclear. We actually have, this is individual, the individual registers and files have their address. So we are actually, we do match it. We do merge it with the voter file. So we do know exactly the individual, the individual's address. We can observe, for a house, you can see the prices of the last two sales. So it's not, you can't see a price history or something like that for an individual who did not sell their house within this time period. So what we do, what we're trying to do, what we do at the zip code level is estimating the local economic shock that is observed by that homeowner.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's not a random sample, the people who actually sold their homes, but it would be interesting to run the same kind of analysis for those that we know for sure. And you could include some discussion about how these voters are different from others, but this is nice because for them the realization of the shock is a lot more salient. They're actually selling and buying them.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Turning to the results, and I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to just I'll try to go quickly through some of the initial just the initial runs where basically we're looking at just the starting points here. So if we were looking at just the first slide looks only at the macroeconomic shocks before we put in the interaction variable of interest. So what we see here is that without voter fixed effects, the recession broadly reduced voter participation by about 4%. If we add in voter fixed effects, right, that magnitude doubles to about 9%. So for both of these stories here, both of these columns here, we're seeing that the Great Recession really did seem to have seems to give credence to the withdrawal hypothesis, which is basically that people were too busy trying to deal with employment and losses and trying to make mortgage payments, that voting was not a priority for them. But what we are particularly interested in, though, is what happens when you control for localized housing shocks. And this is where our first finding kind of reverses that story I just told. So yes, it does turn out that with the addition of the recession and negative shock interaction variable, the recession variable magnitude by itself is still about 9%. So there's still this sort of a general reduction in voting from the Great Recession, but that is mediated in those areas that had a negative shock. So this is our binary variable. And what you see here is that those areas that experienced a negative economic shock, the effect there is an increase in the voters' propensity to vote. This is observed also in column number 2. In column number 2, where you see that that size actually really does matter. So for voters who experience a greater shock on average, their propensity to vote in an election is greater still. So what we argue is that the mobilization effect seems to swamp that withdrawal effect, and it's certainly dependent on the size of the shock. I'm going to skip the runs where we broke up the size into buckets and move on to a slightly different analysis. So our main result is that there is a there is this sort of mediating effect of a negative shock on the propensity to vote. But what we can also do with this data is that we have this really rich data on the type of election, on the types of election that that the voter is facing. And so we can do some analysis on comparing sort of elections where you might expect there to be a lot of voter interest, so such as a federal election, a general election, versus ones that are maybe more local or county elections. So we break up elections into what we call on-cycle and off-cycle. So on-cycle elections are elections where there's a federal office being contested. So these are your fall elections in even-numbered years. Off-cycle elections are everything else. So they're your local and county elections. What we see here is that the mediation, the salience of a big federal or general election is really observed when we're talking about a negative shock bringing people out to the polls. So it really does seem to be the case that when a voter faces a negative neighborhood shock, they're more likely to vote in the big elections. So indicating that they really do want to either punish elected officials, or they want federal or state officials to provide some kind of remedy. We found this kind of surprising. We thought this was surprising because we honestly we thought that that local economic shocks make you more attuned to local politics and make you desire to be more political active in local politics. But that's not what we find here. We compare those on-cycle and off-cycle effects. So what we did was we also tried to look at just those elections that were only municipal elections. So the elections where there was only municipal races. So mayors, city councilors, local initiatives, and so on. And we did find that basically the municipal elections, even though these elections are the closest to individuals in terms of sort of local impact, they don't drive people out to the polls when they face that local negative shock. So we find that the salience only goes so far as it really in that the local economic shocks really have an impact on the more general, on the bigger elections. We also try to exploit variation in our data set because we have rich data on race of the voter, race of the voter, and a party affiliation of the voter. When we stratify our data set on Black voters, white voters, and Hispanic voters, and we run the model separately for each type of voter, we find that there really is not much difference between voters. So we are, the reason for doing this is to really just verify that the variation that we're getting, the behavior that we're getting is really due to the housing price shock at the local level and not due to individual characteristics that might affect voting propensity. So knowing, of course, that Black voters and Hispanic voters have different propensities to vote than white voters, this analysis shows that that's not what's really driving our positive coefficient here.
Hey, Ron?
Yes.
Have you thought about doing heterogeneity by property value?
I do have a slide for something like that, and a few slides down. Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. We also try to look to see if the race, the neighborhood and its demographic makeup have any impact on whether that will kill our result. But as it turns out, at the end of the day, there really is not much of a difference between neighborhoods that are very high Black versus high Black versus neighborhoods that are very high white versus neighborhoods that are very high Hispanic. So again, we are not able to, we don't think that it's differences in the demographic makeup of a neighborhood that's responsible for this effect. We think really is, at the end of the day, still a housing shock a story. Similarly, for party affiliation, there does not seem to be very much of a difference between Democratic affiliated voters, Republican voters, or independent voters. And in terms of income, what we do find is that that if we break up neighborhoods by terciles of income, we do find that the response seems to be driven by those voters in the lowest and in the highest terciles of income. We also try to control for different vulnerabilities in the neighborhood in the period leading up to the recession. So there was some concern that basically the areas that with the highest housing price shocks, those neighborhoods with the highest housing price shocks, these are the areas that are probably the most vulnerable to the Great Recession. So these are places where there could be, already vulnerability due to very unstable employment or due to a particular industry being in that area. So what we tried to think about was different ways to measure pre-recession vulnerability. So for instance, we asked ourselves, we took our sample and we broke it up into terciles of unemployment. So this is pre-recession zip codes that have high unemployment rates, and we compared that to terciles of the tercile of the zip codes with low unemployment rates, and we look to see if there's anything very different here. Interestingly, we find that it is that positive effect of driving people out to the polls, right? As a result of the negative shock, it's really reflected in those areas that were already very, very vulnerable in terms of unemployment to the Great Recession. So what it's doing is this local economic shock seems to be magnifying the vulnerability, and therefore having a much more of a mobilization effect than in areas that were relatively immune to the shocks of employment. We also did this for looking at industries, the employment at the zip code level in industries that we deem to be at high risk from the Great Recession. So these industries were deemed to be the fire industry, so finance, insurance, real estate, as well as construction. And we find, again, there seems to be a different impact between zip codes with high at-risk industries versus low ones. But this one, interestingly and maybe surprisingly for us, it went the other way. We would have thought that industries, the zip codes with high degrees of people in high-risk industries would generate a higher coefficient on this recession interaction dummy, but it turns out it was on the low at-risk tercile. If anybody has any suggestions or why we might be seeing this observation, we definitely, I hope that we could chat later and we can talk a little bit about that, but that's still it still is puzzling us. And just to end on, we also controlled for the strength of the local housing markets. David had mentioned something about looking at different property values. To proxy for how property values and how strong and robust the housing market is, instead of using property values pre-recession, we defined two measures of the robustness of a housing market. One is the vacancy rate, and the other is the foreclosure rate. I'll draw your attention to the foreclosure rate because I'm short of time here, but we do find, inconsistent with the story that I've been telling about being vulnerable, being a significant factor in whether or not people perceive a negative shock to be significant. We do find that those areas that had high foreclosure rates prior to the Great Recession, these are the zip codes where that negative shock has a more telling effect, has a more strong effect on driving on getting people out to vote. We have what I like to do now is just to end on sort of what next steps we are taking to continue to explore this, to continue to explore some of the questions and concerns that we'd had as we from referees and also from presenting this paper. There was some degree, I think Luis had kind of hinted at this, that there was some concern about migration in and out of the neighborhood and whether or not the migration of individuals into an area could affect our first stage. And so what we do is what we've been doing is we've been collecting data on sort of zip code level measures of migration into and out of the neighborhood. We also understand that there is a huge cost in our study of focusing only on owner occupiers. And there was some concerns about what happens if you don't have, if you're taking out the renters. So what we're doing is we're doing two things. One is that we're running our models by explicitly controlling for the degree of renter occupied housing units and also the median rents. But we also are going to do one more thing, and that is we're going to try to run the analysis, the whole analysis, not at the individual level, but more at a zip code level. So to allow for to allow for turnout to be measured based on the universe of voters, as opposed to on just the owner occupiers that we are studying in our study. So it's a robustness check that will help us to sort of understand, hopefully, whether or not the renters are and the renters' behavior is driving our main result. Just to give a recap of the paper, what we did find was that overall, the macroeconomic threat posed by the Great Recession really did have this overall decline in voting, but that is mediated by localized economic conditions. So for areas that are exposed to larger negative price shocks, we see that decline in voting being made up for, and in fact being more than made up for by an increase in voting. There does seem to be some heterogeneity, but in terms of things like racial, in terms of race and income, there does seem to be this neighborhood heterogeneity that seems to matter for some of the demographics, but at the end of the day, individual voter characteristics, the ones that we do have, such as race and a voter affiliation, don't really add much. So our main result is that even national politics and national economic events needs to respond to local conditions and local shocks. So our next steps, as I said, we want to test if the results hold up in place for the broader universe of registrants, and of course, with that, I would really welcome a further discussion on what other things we can add to this paper to bolster our main finding. I think, yes. Oh, that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. That was fantastic. Perhaps we can have some time for Q&A. So any questions?
So, and I've asked before, but I had another one. And Ron, I mean, first of all, congratulations. This is great work. A lot of the things that it seems like you're doing, like looking at, migrants and the prevalence of renters, is on one end interesting in and of itself because it might give you some insights on how this affects different types of population. On the other end, there's, I think, and maybe this was brought up by referees, there's the concern about either reverse causality or endogeneity in general, right? Like there's other things that could be driving people to vote more or less, and to have, like, I don't know, their local amenities. I don't know, I'm thinking there's a spur in crime, and so there's a decline in the house prices, and people tend to be more aware and to vote more. So I think in general it would be useful I think it would not be difficult to use some kind of shift share analysis with an instrument where we know that different types of homes had a higher likelihood of having different losses in value during the Great Recession. Let's say suburbs versus more dense places or exurban areas. And so you looked at the composition of those and just looked at the change in overall price of neighborhoods with similar compositions of physical characteristics during the Great Recession, then that could remove a little bit of something that could be very, very local, like changes in crime rates. So I know that, yeah, I think it would be a useful thing. I don't think it should replace your main results, because I always think that sometimes with these instruments, then you get a similar effect, but you're not really getting at what is driving that anyway.
Yeah.
So I think like your subsample analysis is a better way to go, but I think you might unavoidably face these types of requests. So it might be better to get it done beforehand.
Thank you. That's a point well taken. Yeah.
On just a quick questions, like, do you know the impacts on the result of the vote? Have you seen, with this decline in the voting, people decline the people coming out to vote? Do you see that result swing from the previous election?
When you say results, do you mean turnout, or
The outcome?
the outcome?
I mean the incumbent.
We don't know. We don't observe anything about the outcome.
Right.
We thought about whether, we thought about whether or not to somehow incorporate the outcome of an election, but I don't think we can consistently we first of all, we would be worried about things like reverse causality, where basically using the outcome to sort of to understand why people vote. But second of all, I don't think we could not figure out a way to, how do you measure an outcome? I mean, I suppose we could see whether, if these were referenda, for instance, then we could say, does it lead to more yeses versus nos? But these are more, these are for elected officials. So I mean, I wouldn't have any way to tell a story between why a person would vote for a Democrat versus a Republican, for instance.
No, I mean, just look at a simple swing outcome. Maybe before this election, who are the incumbent?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Because I'm just concerned about this declining voting behavior. Whether people who decline to come to vote, is it because they're unhappy with the existing weapon, or because they're just simply too occupied by this economic kind of track? Right. Because I think those who came out to vote, I guess probably their voting behavior may not have changed, but those who declined to vote probably have some impact on those the voting outcome. I'm not sure how you can measure it.
Yeah.
Right.
You could imagine like seeing whether or not whether an incumbent is on the ballot could affect whether turnout happens or whether turnout goes up. I believe I believe our RAs collected that variable. I'd have to look into it, but I believe our RAs collected it, but we decided not to use it. But it might be worth looking into.
Yeah, because you have 10 years of data, 2006 to 2016, right? I mean, during the recession, 2007 to 2009. Yeah. I mean, that election outcome, you can also compare, what happened post-recession, whether the voting behavior changed when there's no macroeconomic threats.
Yeah.
Right. We see that number of voting increase again after the recession, or what?
So you're saying so basically you're just saying you'd like to know whether or not the actual like at a broad level did voting turnout go up or go down after the recession.
Yeah, if you want to show that this macroeconomic track actually causes this voting behavior, then we were trying to find another comparison with this after the macroeconomic kind of recession period. What will happen to the behavior? Do we see that voting number increase again, or is it persistently low? Then the effect may not be due to the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our recession dummy, as I said, is consistently consistently negative. So I mean, there's
Right.
this general trend
Right.
down, like it represented like sort of a like this sort of a shift downward. But yeah, we didn't I think this was a question that was asked maybe hinted at. We did do runs where the recession was not a 1-0 based on like whether you're after or before the recession. We did ones where the recession was a set of dummies. So recession, a dummy for 2010, one for 2011, one for 2012, and so on, to see whether or not the turnouts would sort of recover or something like that.
Right.
We did not see anything that different from our main result.
Right.
Any other questions or comments or suggestions for the authors? All right, I guess that concludes our seminar. Thanks to everybody for participating, and feel free to exchange your ideas or thoughts with the authors, and look forward to seeing everybody next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody's questions, comments.
Thank you, Ron, very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.